Hi, welcome to our next subunit. We're going to be looking at the art of the Byzantine culture or the Byzantine Empire. And to speak of Byzantine art is a bit problematic since the Byzantine Empire and its art spanned more than a millennium and penetrated geographical regions far from its capital in Constantinople. So Byzantine art includes works created from the 4th all the way up to the 15th century, and also encompasses parts of the Italian peninsula, the eastern edge of the Slavic world, the Middle East, and North Africa. So exactly what is Byzantine art and what do we mean when we use this term? It's helpful to know that Byzantine art is generally divided into three distinct periods: early Byzantine, which goes from 330 to 750, Middle Byzantine 850 to 1204, and then Late Byzantine 1261 to 1453. Obviously, we're not going to cover all of these. We're just going to kind of survey um, some of the art and architecture, again, because it's such an extensive time period. But it is important for you to know how long and expansive this empire was. So here's a map of the Byzantine Empire. Again, it's also known as the Eastern Roman Empire. So this is the eastern part during the late Roman Empire, it was divided into half. And so the Eastern Roman Empire was predominantly Greek speaking. It was a continuation of the eastern half of the Roman Empire during late antiquity and Middle Ages. Its capital city was Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, and it was originally founded as Byzantium, Byzantium. So this was a sort of Greek city. It survived the 5th century fragmentation and fall of the Western Roman Empire and continued to exist for an additional 1,000 years until it fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. So this is sort of the area that we're going to be kind of focusing on. In the capital of Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, we will see and examine some of the sort of what we consider Eastern inspired decorations, mosaics, ivories, metalwork. And we do see a continued shift from classical Greco-Roman naturalism away from that into a more sort of anti-classical depiction of art. So issues to consider when we're talking about Byzantine art, and these are conventions. So the development of Byzantine imperial ideal, it's a fusion of political and religious symbols. It's a fusion of temporal and the spiritual world. So basically the earth and sort of the secular and the sacred world. This is also the emperor of Justinian, and so there's a court style that develops when he's the emperor. We're going to study the effects of the iconoclastic controversy between 730 and 843 on Byzantine style. This is when it became sort of illegal to worship images, and spiritualizing, or this sort of hierarchic style, an approach capable of conveying complex Christian symbolism. And so the goal here is to express religious meaning rather than external appearances. So we see that, again, the sort of shift away from observation of nature and really trying to be more conceptual in their expression and communication of Christian ideas. So I'm sorry, these are themes that we're exploring. These are actual bit conventions. So there's a rejection of space, um, light, color, and physicality of the real world in favor of a timeless sort of supernatural world. There's this idea of dematerialization of figures as well as the interiors of architecture spaces. We'll see human figures become very linear, flattened, geometric simplification, little or no chiaroscuro, which is this kind of shading and value that can make an object look three-dimensional. And this loss of illusion So again, it's a movement away from this sort of nature-like Greco-Roman style where they were, trying to make observations from nature. Hierarchical, frontal, abstract, and symbolic, motionless, unchanging, eternal. These are sort of adjectives that can be used to describe the Byzantine. There's a return to the hierarchic scale, in terms of larger figures being more important. Again, there's this frontality, sort of flatness of the figure, abstraction, stylization, more emphasis on the symbolism. And again, it's this idea that these figures are so stiff and sort of stylized because they're supposed to represent this sort of unchanging, eternal, supernatural, heavenly world. We'll definitely see in terms of the decorative program inside church architecture the use of mosaics and clear story lighting. Combination of those two really serve to dematerialize the interior architectural spaces of a lot of these Christian churches. And then the iconography of Christian spaces in relationship to decoration. Um, and then we're going to look at the off-axis entrance to a church, or the central church plan as well. All right, so what you're looking at is part of a diptych. This is an ivory sort of relief carving, and it depicts Michael the archangel, who is the fierce angel who throws Lucifer out of heaven and also expels Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. And so, again, like we started to talk about when we were looking at the early Christian art, we really see this continued development of Christian archetypes using ancient Roman and pagan sources. Here, St. Michael resembles a Nike figure, a winged victory that we saw represented in, examples in the Parthenon, the Pantheon, and the winged victory of Samothrace from the Hellenistic Greek period. Here, St. Michael resembles a Nike figure. The new adaptations include the figures holding an orb surmounted by a cross, again symbolizing the Christian world, in his left hand. The figure is holding a staff that represents authority. The figure is positioned underneath an arch with a wreath above, symbolizing victory. So there are some classical elements. I think when you look at it, you can sort of see the drapery it seems a little classical. The reference to the triumphal arch, or this idea of referencing classical architecture. However, when we look closer, the angel's feet are very odd looking, and flat and pointed down on the stairs. And so this isn't very natural looking. It almost looks like he's floating. Also, the figure of Michael is much too large for the architectural space he is depicted in. While there is a presence of classical drapery, and remember, there is still a lot of classical art around. Here's a comparison of the figure, the archangel figure, with an early Greek stele. You can sort of see the infusion of classical features, but also this movement away from illusion and direct observation from the natural world. And so the message here is directive in terms of the depiction of the archangel. It's not trying to imitate the natural world. It's trying to communicate a different idea and expression. Let me zoom in on his feet so you can see what I'm talking about here. And this is something we're going to see. Like, these figures become very flat, very stylized. They almost seem like they're sort of floating. But it's also interesting to see how, much of the iconography does come from a lot of pagan symbols and icons that have been adapted. All right, now we're going to start looking at some Byzantine architecture. So the Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity and in 330 moved his capital from Rome to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, at the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. Christianity flourished and gradually replaced the Greco-Roman gods that had once defined Roman religion and culture. This religious shift dramatically affected the art that was created across the empire. The earliest Christian churches were built during this period, including the famed Hagia Sophia, which you're looking at right now. This was built in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian. Decorations for the interior of the church, including icons and mosaics, were also made during this period. So you can kind of see how these are decorated. Um, um, so they really, and um, we looked at some mosaics when we were looking at early Christian churches in the western part of what used to be the Roman Empire, and we started to look at this idea of how mosaics, the combination of mosaics and light, really evoked this kind of dematerialized and sort of heavenly space. So what we'll see is that, especially with the decorative mosaics and the Hagia Sophia, very ethereal figures that seem to float against a gold background. Let me see if I can bring one up. Here's a famed example of what I'm going to talk about. And if you look at this, you can see the feet are very similar to that figure, the ivory carved archangel we looked at earlier. But definitely there's a sort of definitely outlining the idea of drapery has become very stylized. The figures definitely lack any sort of canonical proportion. The heads seem very small. There's no individualization of the face. And again, these figures, there's no sense of illusion. There's really just basically a gold backdrop. And again, it was meant to kind of communicate this heavenly, supernatural world. That, figures from heaven don't, they don't exist the way we exist on earth in terms of gravity and those types of aspects. And that's what, this is what worshipers thought. Here's an example of it, sort of, so you can see it actually embedded within the decorative program of the interior of the Hagia Sophia. Um, so by placing these figures in a spiritual world, the mosaics gave worshipers some access to that world as well. But at the same time, there are real world political messages affirming the power of the ruler in these mosaics. We see here that Justinian is actually represented in this mosaic. We'll talk about that in more detail. And in this sense, the art of the Byzantine Empire continued some of the traditions of Roman art. So the Hagia Sophia is probably one of the most famous churches, Christian churches, and rivals the previous ancient structures in Rome, such as the Pantheon. Um, and the church was later, it started off as a Christian church. It was later converted to a mosque and now serves as a museum. The four minarets, which are right here, these are Islamic. So this was a later addition when the church was converted to a mosque. And the structure was commissioned by the Emperor Justinian, and it was built in 5 short years. Here's another view of it. The great church of the Byzantine capital, Constantinople, took its current structure form under the direction of the Emperor Justinian I. The church was dedicated in 537 amid a great ceremony and the pride of the emperor, who was sometimes said to have seen the completed building in a dream. The daring engineering feats of the building are well known, especially that dome. Numerous medieval travelers praise the size and embellishment of the church. Tells about miracles associated with the church existed. Hagia Sophia is the symbol of Byzantine art in the same way that the Parthenon embodies classical Greek art, or the Eiffel Tower really typifies what we think of when we think of Paris. Each of these structures express values and beliefs, perfect proportion, industrial confidence, perfect proportion in terms of the Pantheon. I'm sorry, the Parthenon, and industrial confidence in terms of the Eiffel Tower, and this idea of this unique spirituality that we see with the Hagia Sophia and the early Christian culture. By overall impressions and attention to detail, the builders of Hagia Sophia left the world um, a very mystical building. The fabric of the building denies that it can stand by its construction alone. Hagia Sophia seems to cry out for an otherworldly explanation of why it stands, because much within the building seems dematerialized, an impression that must have been very real in the perception of the medieval faithful. So where the Greeks and the Romans didn't necessarily try to hide how the structure was made or supported, or the basic forms. Um, the Byzantines really wanted to combine light and the mosaics, and to really give this sense of sort of a floaty building, a very dematerialized building that almost didn't seem real. So this is an example of a centralized floor plan with a longitudinal axis. Here we see a fusion of a centralized church plan with a basilica floor plan from early Christian churches. Um, so when you look here, um, it's definitely more of a square format. You have the dome, but you do have some features. Here, the entrance, we kind of have this court. Then we go in, and here's the naos, and then above that, the naos is the dome that sort of creates a different space. The apse again is the sort of the focal point as well. So this is more of a combination of a basilica plan and a central church plan. So this is the interior of what the Hagia Sophia looks like. We know that the faithful attributed the structural success of the Hagia Sophia to divine intervention. Nothing is more illustrative of the attitude than descriptions of the dome of the Hagia Sophia. Um, For Copius, the biographer of the Emperor Justinian and the author of the book on the building of Justinian, is the first to assert that the dome hovered over the building by divine intervention. So this was again a sort of unusual space, just like the Pantheon. The rotunda was very overwhelming when people would walk in. This dome almost seemed though like to kind of float, and you didn't really see where the supports were. So it had that sort of overwhelming effect as well. The huge spherical dome really makes the structure exceptionally beautiful. um, but what people were really fascinated with, and what the architect's aim was, that it didn't seem to rest upon a solid masonry, but to cover the space with its golden dome suspended from heaven. So where the Pantheon, you could see this idea of a definite circle within a square. This is definitely much more subtle and dematerialized, and again seems very mystical. Um, the description became up from, what is his name? Oh, Procopius. Became part of the lore of the great church and is repeated again and again over the centuries. A look at the base of the dome helps explain these descriptions. So the dome is carried on four spherical triangle pendentives. And so I'll have them outlined later, but this is how they're sort of supported, these pendentives. The pendentives implement the transition from the circular base of the dome to the rectangular base below, restraining the lateral forces of the dome, and allows its weight to flow downwards. All right, so here's a better illustration of that. So again, a pendentive is an architectural feature, and it's any of several spandrels in the form of a spherical triangle forming a transition between the circular plan of a dome and the polygonal plan of a supporting masonry. The pendentives made it possible to place the dome over a square. So hopefully you can sort of see how they're defined right here. And here's the dome. Here's a pendentive right here, a close-up of one. And again, most of the time they were decorated or had some sort of beautiful mosaic placed in there. And then here is a diagram showing you pendentives and another architectural feature used to transition a dome over a square space, which is called a squinch. Um, so, in a sense, this is kind of an evolution. So we have the dome on pendentives versus the dome on squinches. A squinch is a construction filling in the upper angle of a square room so as to form a base to receive an octagonal or spherical dome. And this was another solution of this structural problem um, that was provided by pendentives. And we'll see this technique used later, the squinches. But I just wanted to show you a diagram of both. The interior of the church looks like another world, a spiritual world, and that was the intent. The narthex would have been dark, and then when entering the space with the dome and the combination of lighting with mosaics, it really would have been breathtaking for ancient viewers. The lighting in particular, if you note the clerestory of windows inserted into the dome at the sort of bottom of it, emphasizes the spiritual world. And it does, this use of lighting, mosaics, the walls seem to dissolve in light. Again, it's hard to see in a picture, but when you were actually there, that was the effect it would have. The use of the clerestory, which actually has 40 windows going around the circumference, would have helped to lighten the load of the dome as well. So it's an important engineering feature. The windows at the bottom of the dome are closely spaced, visually asserting that the base of the dome is insubstantiable and hardly touching the building itself. So again, that appearance of it being like it's floating. The building planners also, in addition to squeezing the windows together, also lined the jambs or sides of the windows with gold mosaic. As light hit the gold, it bounced around the openings, and it gives this sense that it's eating the structure or eating away at the structure and makes the room again dematerialized and really kind of makes more room for this imagination to seeing a floating dome. So it would be difficult to not accept the fabric as consciously constructed to present a building that is dematerialized by common constructional expectations. Perception outweighs clinical explanation. To the faithful of Constantinople and its visitors, the building used divine intervention to do otherwise what would appear to be impossible. Perception supplies its own explanation. The dome is suspended from heaven by an invisible chain, and that's sort of the effect that they wanted worshipers and viewers to have of this space. And again, unlike the solidity of the Roman structures, Hagia Sophia seems to float and dematerialize. And so the viewer is actually unaware of the physics of the structure. And I think this is a good picture of that. So here's an example of the interior of the Pantheon. And I think you can sort of sense that where with the Roman structure, we get the support of the columns, this circle and square motif being emphasized, and it does have this solidity about it, and in particular with this use of concrete, where the dome in Hagia Sophia really does seem to kind of dissolve. The walls, seem dematerialized, and this sort of light, especially the use of the clerestory around the rim of the dome, really makes the dome seem like it's floating. Another view of it. So in addition to the main dome, there's also these half domes. Some are smaller and larger. The original dome collapsed entirely after the quake of 558. In feet 563, a new dome was built. The second dome collapsed as well in 2 episodes, so that today only 2 sections of the present dome in the north and south side still date from the original 562 reconstruction. Of the whole dome, 40 ribs. Their surviving north section contained 8 ribs, while the south section includes 6 of the original. These are ribs, and we'll talk more about ribbing when we get into Gothic architecture, or what's left. The original mosaics and decorations have also been lost. To get an idea of how the decorative program might have looked, we will travel to Ravenna, where Justinian had an outpost in the west due to this movement of iconoclasm, where they, forbid the worship of images. An icon is Greek for image or painting, and during the medieval era, this meant a religious image on a wooden panel used for prayer and devotion. More specifically, icons came to typify the art of the Orthodox Christian Church. Iconoclasm refers to the destruction of images or hostility toward visual representations in general. More specifically, the word is used for the iconoclastic controversy that shook the Byzantine Empire for more than 100 years. Open hostility towards religious representations began in 726 when Emperor Leo III publicly took a position against icons. This resulted in their removal from churches and their destruction. There have been many previous theological disputes over visual representations, their theological foundations and legitimacy. However, none of these caused the tremendous social, political, and cultural upheaval of the iconoclastic controversy. So we're going to actually travel in our next segment to a Byzantine church that was actually located in what was the western part of the Roman Empire when it was divided in half, and the capital was moved from Rome to Ravenna, and Justinian had an outpost there and had a church, and so we'll be able to look at really what the beautiful mosaics would have looked like. You can see here a lot of Islamic motifs from when it was converted into a mosque. So here we have sort of the Islamic um, lettering, the written word from the Quran. Um, but anyway, stay tuned. We're going to be looking at some important mosaics, and we're going to travel to Ravenna. So stay tuned.